Okay.
Good morning, CPAC. For me, it is such a great honor to follow Mark Levin. Wasn't the great one great? The Gathering Storm is Winston Churchill's first volume of his magnificent history of the Second World War. And in this book, Churchill shows how the great Western democracies, particularly Britain and France, failed to create an enduring peace and inadvertently pave the way for the rise of the Third Reich. Michael Pillsbury, Hudson Institute, author of The 100-Year Marathon. Are we seeing in Asia a storm gathering?
Yes, and I'm happy to tell you, Gordon, that Donald Trump saw this and wrote about it as far ago as the year 2000. He talked about China as the main challenge, described some of their misconduct. At that time, he was criticized, his warnings were ignored. So it's a bit like Winston Churchill.
So what we're seeing right now then, in a sense, is that the West, and America especially, has not heeded the warnings of President Trump, then an individual, and other people like yourselves who have seen the danger in the Chinese political system and how it's aggressive, belligerent, and territorially expansive.
Yes, in fact, Donald Trump escalated his warning in another book I brought with me today, Gordon. It's called Great Again. It came out in 2015. And in this book, he has the new thesis that there is what he calls a good China and a bad China. And he says his goal is to get the good China to be permanent and to be positive for the United States. But then he's got a wonderful sentence in here, Gordon, that says, some people have asked me not to refer to China as our enemy, but they are.
You know, and that's really important, because when you think about what the Chinese are doing, Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, is dropping hints that China is the world's only sovereign state. He's going back to that language of the imperial era, Tianxia, when the Chinese emperor ruled all under heaven. And clearly we've heard his foreign minister talk about this, about how they want to replace the Westphalian system, which is the current international order. And that means that Xi Jinping believes that he is the world's only ruler. And that means there's not much room for instance, the United States.
I think what President Trump did when he took office is get the attention of the Chinese. They've made clear to me and others that they deeply respect him. In some sense, they're afraid of him. They've read his books about his comments about China. And so his first step was to say he wasn't sure the one China policy really would bind him. And he got President Xi, who he calls his friend, he got President Xi to ask him to adhere to the one China policy. So that was the first step. Then the trade talks began. The Chinese really wouldn't come. They denied everything, Gordon. They said, we have not done any intellectual property theft. We haven't forced technology transfer. And basically, we're not going to negotiate with you. So then the second big step President Trump took, for which he's heavily criticized, was put the tariffs on. And the tariffs he announced were punitive. This was not some kind of protection for American industry. It was to punish China for the technology theft and the intellectual property theft.
And that theft is $300 to $400 billion a year, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. But we're talking about the Chinese criminally taking hundreds of billions of dollars from the U.S. If we can't commercialize our innovation, Mike, we don't have a future.
I think that's true. And the third step President Trump took was very close to what you just said. He said it twice now in press conferences, one very recently. China wants to surpass America. He said it very clearly both times in these press conferences. China wants to surpass America. But then his heroic next sentence is, it's not going to happen on my watch. I think that's great.
And what we have seen in prior administrations, really going back to Nixon, was an integrationist view of China, that we believe that if we showed kindness, if we tried to bring the Chinese into the international system, they would reciprocate. They might want to compete with us in that international system, but the idea was that China would become benign. And because of that, we've had accommodationist policies that have, in effect, accepted unacceptable behavior on the part of the Chinese, including territorial aggression, which we have seen continually throughout, not just in the South China Sea, but in the East China Sea, also in the Himalayas with India. This is a country that has believed that the West would not stop its ambitions.
Gordon, I think I would add something just by a show of hands. How many people here are Christians? How many Christians are in the audience? China makes Christianity illegal unless you do it the Chinese way. This is really bad. The oppression of Christians in China has increased over the last 10 years. And a lot of evangelical Christians used to take what they called the quiet diplomacy route. Don't talk about it. Somehow ask the Chinese nicely, please allow Christianity. In fact, that made it worse. What actually has happened, Gordon, the Chinese Communist Party, which is now 80 million members, you cannot be a Christian, you must be an atheist to be a member of the Chinese Communist Party. This has long-term consequences. It's part of what President Trump, when he wrote this book in 2015, he called the bad China. So that's got to be on our agenda, and I think President Trump is already doing this. I think that's a heroic step, too.
You know, Mike, we talk about, for instance, the concentration camps where China has imprisoned more than 1 million Uyghurs and Kazakhs, Muslims. But what we have seen, especially over the last year or so, is an extension of this concentration camp program now into Tibet. We have seen a stepped-up campaign against the Christians. Even they're going against the Buddhists, who once were thought to be acceptable religionists. And so Xi Jinping is obviously determined to eliminate religion. And for us, that's very important, because not just because we may be Christian or whatever, but maybe because we're people of faith. But it's important because we see Chinese ambitions. And if we don't stop them at an early stage, we know that this is not just going to be confined to China. This is going to be something we're going to see elsewhere. You know, we look at this, we also see Huawei Technologies, nominally an employee-owned company, but really just an instrumentality of the Chinese state. Mike, when you see Huawei's ambitions to give its technology, its equipment to dominate the world's backbone for 5G, the next generation of wireless communications, what do you see?
Well, President Trump has talked about the hidden activities of China, and Huawei claims to be a private company. In fact, they're masquerading as an arm of the Chinese Communist Party. So if they can get control of the global telecommunications system, it tends to split our alliances. So the battle against Huawei, once again, is what, when Donald Trump was a candidate, the good China versus the bad China. The bad China, the hidden China, the deception, the secret control of global telecommunications, that's what President Trump is struggling against. And I think he's got a very clever, smart strategy. He's made friends with Xi Jinping, who's the master of the Chinese Communist state and the party. If he succeeds with this trade deal by having Xi Jinping come over to Mar-a-Lago, and it covers things like the Huawei deception, we're talking about one of the biggest historic agreements between the United States and any other country in world history. President Trump has made clear he knows China is the second largest economy in the world. This is the first largest and the second largest, having negotiations in Mar-a-Lago. And what President Trump has set up is that the Chinese are coming to our home territory for the final deal. I think that's heroic too.
I got to ask you a question, though, Mike. The president has read your book, The 100-Year Marathon. Obviously, you talk about a long-term Chinese goal to dominate the world. And the issue is going to be, we've tried to accommodate the Chinese, and by doing that, we've shown them that aggression works, that all the worst elements in the Chinese political system, like in Japan in the 1930s, they're starting to take over the Chinese military. So the question I have to ask you is, can we coexist with a belligerent, provocative China? Is there some way that we can find an accommodation with them, or are we just kidding ourselves, like, for instance, Britain and France were kidding themselves about accommodating Hitler's Germany?
I think what Vice President Mike Pence said, and he got into it a little bit last night here at CPAC as well, he's held out the vision the same as President Trump in his book. Yes, we can coexist with China, but we've got to have reciprocity. We've got to have equal treatment. We've got to have fairness. No more ripping off American companies, no more violation of the world order principles, and most important of all, President Trump wants to preserve American leadership. The greatest challenge from China is to the American created and led world order that the Chinese already have been quite clear. They want to subvert. They want a Chinese-led world order.
And
that's dangerous.
And our concept of the world is very different. It's open. You know, although the U.S.
Democracy,
clearly free
surveillance
trade,
and privacy.
open commons, open global commons, and the Chinese are against all of those things. It's going to be, I think, very difficult to take the Chinese and at least the Communist Party and try to integrate it. Though, of course, we can have great relations with the Chinese people. We've had before the Communist Party came into power in 1949. This is the 70th anniversary of the communism in China. So, you know, Mike, as you look about this, the thing that does concern me, as I mentioned, is that the Chinese military, like the Japanese military in the 1930s, is gaining political power.
Yes.
And that
I call them the hawks. I call them the hawks of China.
And that poses a challenge to the United States that, and our allies and partners that is very difficult for us to deal with.
I think that's right, Gordon, and that's why my favorite phrase President Trump has used twice is "not on my watch." What that means for CPAC, we've got to support the president in his policies toward China. We can't pretend like this is a minor issue, that the border is the only thing. It's China. He's made it very clear.
And yet, Mike, in the United States, there are so many people and so many interest groups that have tried to undercut President Trump's resolute policies on China. You know, Trump inherited a very dangerous situation with the Chinese. We've had 4 decades of policies that have been sounding good to the ear, but really haven't quite worked. And so Trump has faced a Chinese which thinks that they can push us around. And you know, you said that Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, that he admires President Trump, but the most important thing is that he fears President Trump. He fears American policy. This is,
Yes.
I'm afraid.
I think it's great.
I'm afraid that the only way to deal with Beijing like this is to show strength. But there are people in America, there are financial interests, there are stock market investors who are putting pressure on the president to back down.
That's true. That's where the role of CPAC comes in, and conservatives across the country. I was in President Reagan's administration. I had a kind of quiet, unknown job, the head of policy planning in the Pentagon. And we relied heavily on the conservative media, conservative movement, CPAC. In fact, Reagan had first gone in 1974 to CPAC. We relied on conservatives to try to defeat people inside the government who still wanted to follow the Jimmy Carter policy of détente with the Soviet Union. This is a strong struggle. I see it going on now with President Trump, where there's just too much resistance to what he wants to do.
And you remember that all the wise people in Washington during the Nixon and the Carter era said that we have no chance to compete with the Soviet Union. We have to have détente. All of this terrible stuff, and then all of a sudden a guy named Ronald Reagan comes up on the scene and says, no, we do not have to accept the Soviet Union.
That's right. Gordon, can I interrupt for a second? There's another concept President Reagan used that the Chinese are directly challenging. President Reagan said many times, the shining city on the hill. That's not just America, it's the global order would be led by America. We would be the shining city on the hill. It's part of President Reagan's dream. The Chinese are out to stop that. They want a pagoda on the hill, not a shining city on the hill. And I don't know if you've all noticed, I hope you have, the new defense strategy the Pentagon put out a few months ago says terrorism is not the #1 threat. Iran and North Korea are not the #1 threat. The #1 threat is China. But
Yeah.
the deep state resists this. They want to continue the old ways, just what we saw in President Reagan's administration. That's where CPAC comes in for the fight.
This is the fight of our lives. This is the fight for our children, for our grandchildren, for our friends and partners around the world. In the early days of what we now know as the Second World War, President Roosevelt called up Churchill and said, "What do I call this global struggle?" Churchill shot back. He said, "The unnecessary war." World War II was unnecessary because the great democracies did not resist the rise of the Third Reich. And we've got to make sure that for us, we do not make that same mistake. So, Mike, I want you to make a pledge with me and the audience that there will be no more wars that are unnecessary.
Okay, no more wars that are unnecessary.
Thank you very much. Mike, this way.